welcome to the final webinar for the Mid-North Coast LHD Safe Space Co-Design. It's really great to be with you today. My name's Carrie. I do some facilitation with Roses, and this is Tina. Tina.
Hi, so I'm involved in a number of things with Roses, but in particular, developing services to support SPP workers. Thanks,
Tina. So today we're just going to take you through the findings of the last survey, and then Tina will take you through the joint co-design session where we brought people with lived experience and health professionals together, and she did that face-to-face with another facilitator, Bridget, last week in Port Macquarie. Thanks, Tina. And we'll also take you through next steps as well for this process.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just having trouble getting the slideshow started. There we go.
Thanks, Tina. So we'll just begin with some acknowledgements. We firstly like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the original occupants and traditional custodians of all the lands we're meeting on. And in the case of virtual co-design, that's sometimes many, but in particular to acknowledge the Warumi, Biripi, Dungati and Gumba Yangir. I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anyone by mispronouncing that, and all the people of the Aboriginal people of the Mid-North Coast region, and to pay our respects to their elders, past, present leaders in those communities, and also to the younger emerging voices. And just really to acknowledge and appreciate the contributions, enormous contributions Aboriginal people and Indigenous communities make to suicide prevention efforts all throughout the country. Thanks, Tina. And then just in the context of this particular co-design, we'd like to acknowledge people with a lived experience. So really just to acknowledge just the uniquely valuable expertise that experts by experience bring to the co-design of services and service improvement. We know that they know what people need and want, and so the bringing them into a co-design process does mean that you're more likely to develop local services that meet the needs and wants of local communities. We also acknowledge that health professionals bring their own lived experience through their professional roles, and they are also impacted by suicide. So we deeply appreciate that they bring that perspective while they're here with a professional hat on. And just also in the context of this local co-design, we really want to acknowledge the LEOs, the Lived Experience of Suicide group. They're a fantastic group of advocates, very passionate, that are in this region, and they really brought just so much wisdom, on the ground wisdom, and real passion and commitment. So we do really appreciate that in this local region. It's really enriched the process. So the process so far, just a quick recap, we had those lived experience focused conversations. We brought people with lived experience together in small groups to hear what their current experiences are of trying to access ED for when in suicidal crisis, supporting someone to do so, or what their experiences are that have meant that they actively avoid reaching out for help through traditional services. Then we had a lived experience session. We were fortunate enough to do that face-to-face, came up there to Port Macquarie. We had a feedback loop similar to this, where we had a webinar and then a survey. We then also in parallel had focused conversations with health professionals to hear what it was like to walk a day in their shoes professionally, trying to provide the very best support for people in crisis. We then also had a health professional combined session where we brought health professionals together. In session 2, we fed them back the information that had been coming out of the co-design outputs, and then they worked on further sort of firming up elements of the model. We had another feedback loop. We've had now the combined session. Tina and Bridget came up to do that face-to-face, and there's some really rich stuff that was gathered there, and Tina will take you through. And we're now at feedback loop 2, so this webinar, and there'll be a follow-up survey, and we'll tell you about that at the end of today's webinar. Thanks, Tina. So in terms of findings from Feedback Loop 2, the responses were, there were 10 survey responses people identified as coming from a lived experience, and we didn't actually have any health professionals respond to the last survey. So I'll take you through what lived experience people told us in that survey.
Yeah, I might just comment on that, Carrie, because we really would like health professionals to become involved in the next survey. We received some information from a couple of health professionals that said they tried to access the survey, but they weren't able to complete it. So we really encourage people to get involved this time. And please, if you do have any trouble, anyone has any trouble getting access to or completing the survey, if you could just let Roses in the Ocean know, because it's really important to us to hear from you.
Thanks, Tina, for pointing that out. And we apologise that people did have trouble with that survey wanting to complete it. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you this time around. So in terms of location of the safe space, there were mixed responses from lived experience respondents regarding the location. Most agreed and some strongly disagreed, a couple did, that the findings thus far were representative of their views. Some respondents felt that a location on hospital grounds would be most appropriate for logistical reasons, to make sure that no one fell through the cracks, was how they put it. One respondent stated that they didn't think it should be on hospital grounds as it's not a clinical service. So there was quite strong divergent views there, and it was super important to hear those divergent views, and so they're reflected here. So further sort of feedback around that would be great to hear. One respondent said they did not feel Elamata House was an appropriate location, so obviously that came up as a location, as it is difficult to find and out of the way. A number of respondents reiterated the importance of peer work presence no matter the location of the service, and 2 respondents stated that Coffs Harbour would be a good location for the safe space. So just to comment more on the geography in terms of location. So a couple of comments here. As the safe space is not a clinical service, I do not believe it should be located on hospital grounds. Instead, an off-site location and an agreed process of linkages to ED should an acute care clinician be required. And then on the other side was ideas around location was, from a lived experience perspective, I feel the safe space needs to be on hospital grounds. I'm concerned that guests will be missed and fall through the cracks if not. And then someone else just said, if peer workers could work or be called to the ED when someone presents in a suicidal crisis, and take them to the safe space where they will be looked after. Thanks, Tina. And then connections pathways to the space. So in recognition that there's no requirement for a formal referral pathway or process into the safe space, all respondents either agreed or strongly agreed that the findings presented were representative of their views regarding connection pathways to the safe space. One respondent was unsure how peer workers would be able to accept people into the safe space with issues outside of current training models. So we did hear that people were concerned not about the idea that peer workers could provide non-clinical support, but more that there are limitations around the availability, I believe, of training and just what it entails. So just that really speaks to the idea that the SP peer workforce is an emerging workforce, and people we're still needing to really get a better understanding of what supports and particularly training and ongoing support. And so I'd really encourage people that are interested, that have sort of a particular interest in what that's going to look like for these peer workers, to have a look at the SP peer workforce guidance documents by the ministry, and they are on the Roses website, and I believe even specifically on the landing page of your LHD. So yeah, that's really where you'll get to be able to dig into sort of the information about what those supports look like. One respondent stated that the space needs a security presence. One respondent stated warm handover as being a critical component in terms of that continuity of care, but also alignment with the values and principles of a non-clinical compassionate response. One respondent was unsure how the direct access to clinical care would work, considering current extended waiting periods. So that's a particular issue that came out of the local co-design process. And one respondent queried how closing time handover and leaving would work. So some of these things are actually worked through in the scenarios. That's the purpose of the scenarios, to work through points of where people have raised issues that haven't been able to be resolved or explored further, but it's also to really test the ways that the safe space will work against the values and principles that have been identified locally in the ministry requirements. So Tina will take you through that soon. Just a couple of quotes here that just speak to what I've just outlined. The warm handover, so people don't think they're being passed the buck on 100%. And then at Leo's level, we discussed in great detail that we devote the safe space to people with depression or suicidal thoughts. So I'm not sure how our peer workers would be able to accept people with issues outside our current peer work training model. So that just speaks to what I was talking about before. Thanks, Tina. Then in terms of the service model, 9 respondents agreed that the service model findings presented were reflective of the views. 1 neither agreed nor disagreed. 1 respondent stated that they felt clinical support is needed. A number of respondents disagreed with the statement, take the time to just sit and talk, mentioning that some people may not want to talk, instead preferring to sit quietly, be alone or just listen. 1 respondent noted that clients' wishes must be upheld with regards to family, as some people's families are their dilemma. So really just talking through that, the whole issue of what does a safe space, what can it offer in terms of carer support, but also what is about, while upholding that idea that this is about the self-determination and autonomy of the guests as required by the ministry. 1 respondent mentioned that family members should be given guidance and counselling first, as they may say and do things which are not helpful, such as criticising statements. So that was one suggestion of how to support carers in their role. And just someone here said some people may not want to talk because they can't get the words out. However, they may want someone to do the talking, be talked to feel included, maybe asked if they just want to listen or be left alone. And then ensure a person-centred approach to the service and directing it to be non-clinical. Thanks, Tina. In terms of staffing, 8 respondents agreed, 1 neither agreed nor disagreed. And then there was 1 person that disagreed that the presented findings were representative of their views. So screening was raised as a potentially inappropriate wording. So there was recognition, and it was talked about in the actual co-design session around the idea that screening is quite a traditional clinical way of talking about those first points of connection and contact with a guest. Unsure of how having a clinician who is visible in the safe space would fit with the non-clinical model of the safe space. Concern regarding the funding models and access to clinical staff for the service, noting the considerable gap in the system with regards to access. 1 respondent suggested the manager role have lived experience. And then just here, a couple of comments. I'm not sure about having a process that is called a screening. Maybe there are other options. And then personally, I'm still not convinced that a highly visible clinician forms part of our welcoming and non-clinical concept for the safe space. However, a low-key approach would definitely work. So a suggestion there of how to strike that balance. Thanks, Tina. Physical environment and accessibility, 8 respondents agreed and 2 neither agreed nor disagreed that the presented findings related to the physical environment and accessibility. A number of respondents requested the space have longer opening hours, especially during the late evening and overnight, or open 24/7 if possible. So that was the blue sky thinking aspect, which is important to a co-design process, so that the LHD can hear that this is what the ideal model was, given that in reality there are organisational and funding constraints. It was stated that the service needs to be available every day. 1 respondent mentioned service animals and whether they are allowed or not has not yet been discussed. And 1 respondent felt that LGBTQI+ Aboriginal and literacy specific issues had not been addressed so far. So with things like that, if you are the respondent and you're watching this webinar, but anyone else, it's super important to spread the word about the last survey, so people from those kind of cultural and social groups can have their say to bring those people into the conversation. Then just a couple of quotes: it needs to be available every day, and also data from EDs in the Mid-North Coast region would most likely indicate higher presentation rates during late evening and possibly overnight. So that's someone explaining that there is information there that could inform the choice around opening hours. And then governance, finally, most respondents agreed that the presented findings regarding governance were reflective of their views, while 1 neither agreed nor disagreed. 1 respondent wanted to ensure that there was a fully stocked first aid kit with temporary stitches available at all time. Feedback should be used in an ongoing manner to improve the service, and there needs to be assurance of ongoing funding and successive budgets. So that idea of sustainability being super important in the establishment and the ongoing success of an innovative new service like this. And someone just saying ongoing opportunity for reflective feedback from staff, guests and wider community on the operating model of the safe space. When we talk to you briefly about next steps, we will talk to you about the opportunities for the redesign and the opportunities for guests to provide meaningful feedback and input into that. I'll hand it over to you, I think. Oh no, we've got some more. Thanks, Tina. In this survey, we've actually got specifically targeted questions that people have taken the time to give responses to. So how should the safe space go about capturing information in a recovery-oriented way in order to meet the minimum data reporting requirements of the ministry? I won't labour on each of these points. If you're watching this as a recording, I would suggest that you pause to really have a look at this information, or to have a look at this information in the survey as well. So I'll just point out some of the key points that were made. Interactive app on a privacy screen with 5 to 6 key questions. So that was a suggestion for how to capture information. And then someone just said not on a person's first visit. So that speaks to the idea that building rapport with peer workers, that can be a barrier at times. That was certainly identified. What do you think the responsibilities and or process for follow-up of people who access the safe space? And we had let's say we had people saying things like ask guests what they want as a follow-up. So that's idea about it being determined by the guest. Consumers have a responsibility to follow up with services. So that's the idea that that responsibility sits with the guests themselves, or being offered information about various local services from peer workers. Thanks, Tina. The next question was, do you think it would be useful for the safe space to have contact points such as an email or phone number? And if so, how would the safe space manage guests who make contact outside of hours? So someone actually suggested that yes, a recorded message and further information on other services should be available. And then a question around opening hours for the service have been decided. So what do you think of these? So Monday, 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m, Thursday to Sunday, 1 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. So someone says data indicates that most people required help, assistance late in the afternoon and evenings. Again, someone says always open. So that is still important to capture in a co-design process, that blue sky thinking around what's the ideal local model, even though there are these, at the moment, these resourcing constraints that dictate these sort of limited opening hours. Thanks, Tina. And then just generally, have you got any additional thoughts or comments on the co-design process so far that you'd like to share? So someone said that it doesn't appear that the process has been fully inclusive of people from all parts of the LHD. It looks heavily focused on the location of Port Macquarie only. And so again, we really encourage people. We understand the limitations of a co-design process. There are many, including the unique ones when you do things virtually. So it's super important that if you are able to connect to formal, but also those really important informal networks that people have in local communities, to ensure that we do have those missing voices in the room in that final survey, and we can feed that information back in the final report. And then just someone said it's great to see so much input and enthusiasm. For me, it would be fantastic to agree on most processes as quickly as possible and put together an initial starting time. Further changes and processes could take place as directed by people's requirements, along with peer worker experience. Thanks, Tina. And so that brings us to really the overview of the findings from that survey. And I would hand over to Tina now, because she can speak to what was said in the room and in the last, and the information that was gathered in, I think it was last week, in that co-design session that Bridget and Tina facilitated in Port Macquarie.
Yeah, so it was a great opportunity last Thursday to meet with everyone face to face, and it's always conversations always happen a little bit differently when you get to have them in person instead of online. So really appreciate all the health professionals and all the people with lived experience in the area who took 2 hours of time out of their really busy days to come and talk about, I guess, what we've identified as some of the really important issues that needed to be spoken about and that we needed to get some different perspectives on before we move forward with this co-design process. So what I'm going to show you now is a summary of what came out of those conversations. And the conversations were mainly around 3 scenarios, and these scenarios were designed specifically to raise some things that might happen in the safe space that people might have some different ideas about, so that we could talk about those different ideas. And so this is the first scenario that we talked about. So it's about Leanne. Leanne walks into the safe space, and she knows the safe space well, having visited for a few weeks in a row. She had previously told the SP peer worker that it's a place where she can relax for a while, knowing that she is safe from self-harming while she is there. Tonight, she appears to be intoxicated, and she's quite agitated that a peer worker who she now feels she can trust isn't available to talk with her. She's becoming quite loud and insistent, and another guest in the safe space has indicated that this is making them feel uncomfortable. So people with lived experience and health professionals provided us their perspectives on how the safe space should respond to someone like Leanne, in particular focusing on how is the safe space going to respond to intoxication? How will it respond to agitation and that potential for perhaps aggression? But also, how is the safe space going to manage the competing needs of different guests in the safe space, given that what one person needs may be completely inconsistent with what another person in the safe space needs? So these were the ideas that came out of that conversation. So around that topic of intoxication, it was suggested that the safe space and the SPP workers should address Leanne's distress first and then the intoxication. So the priority should be Leanne's level of distress. It was suggested they could refer her to other resources such as drug and alcohol services, but they needed to connect with her first before getting her to move on. So she needs to feel like she's not just being shifted onto another service. It was stressed that it's important to observe Leanne's behaviour, that someone might be intoxicated, but their behaviour could still be okay. And if their behaviour is okay, then they should be allowed to stay. They said it should be an open space, but there need to be parameters. So one idea was that they could have a breathalyzer as a safety precaution in the safe space, although other people pointed out that different people's behaviour is affected in different ways by different amounts of alcohol. And I think the thing that really came strongly out of this conversation is that it's Leanne's behaviour that needs to be where the parameters are set. So there needs to be a set limit where the safe space reassesses, and you know that there was concern that using a breathalyzer, some people said that could be too clinical. It was pointed out that regular visitors would probably know that intoxication is not allowed, and also that people who haven't visited the safe space before perhaps can't be expected to have that understanding. They asked, so a person with lived experience pointed out and asked, is the alcohol a precursor to leave? Because if she is at that point and that is why she's drinking, being rejected from the safe space could actually be the final straw for her. And a number of people with lived experience felt that was something that needed to be considered. It was also pointed out if someone is having a drink, there still needs to be action from the safe space. The person still needs to be followed up, and that the safe space should allow for a certain amount of risk, given that its priority is to meet the needs of the person who's approached for assistance. It was suggested that that Leanne's aggression be validated by understanding that there's a reason for it and asking Leanne why she's upset and talking with her about why she's upset. So our understanding in this scenario is that it does have something to do with the fact that the SPP worker that she usually speaks to isn't available. And so speaking with her about that and validating those feelings. In terms of how the SPP workers could respond to someone like Leanne, it was stressed that the quality of peer worker is paramount and that they will need to have expertise and appropriate training so that they can monitor a situation like this. It was suggested that it's important for peer workers to introduce guests to all other peer workers in the team, so that if the guest returns and a particular peer worker isn't available, that there are other people, other peer workers in the space that can provide them with support. It was also said that if someone like Leanne is a regular visitor, we might be able to find out over time whether Leanne has regular friends or family that she could contact at a time like this, who might be able to come and pick her up from the safe space, for instance, if that's what Leanne is interested in. In terms of that balancing the needs of other guests, it was suggested that guests who are feeling uncomfortable might be able to be moved to a different location where they feel more comfortable, where, for instance, they may not be exposed to what's going on for Leanne at the moment. But there were also alternative views, and that alternative view was that it's Leanne herself who should be taken to a different room, and that it shouldn't be the person who's feeling uncomfortable that gets removed. Another comment on the competing needs of guests was that it's important to work as a team and to prioritise who is most in need at the time. So the SPP workers would need to look at the guest who's feeling uncomfortable and look at Leanne and work out who is in the greatest need at that specific point. The SPP workers need to utilise various resources, other staff, iPads, different areas of the safe space, and that perhaps, and being open to the fact that guests might be willing to support each other. So when there are a number of guests in the safe space, that is also an option if it's something that guests feel comfortable doing. So as you can see, scenario 1 was a huge scenario for us to talk about. Scenario 2 also brought up some really important issues and brought out some very diverse perspectives. So scenario 2 is about David, who turns up at the safe space for the first time, and he seems quite agitated and distracted. He heard about the safe space from a community service worker who supports him in a program for people with complex and enduring mental illness. He tells the SPP worker that his neighbour is trying to control his thoughts through a chip he has planted in his television. And David said he can't handle the torment of this anymore, and he feels that killing himself is the only way to get relief from it. So again, a number of ideas came out from talking about how the safe space could respond to David's situation. It was pointed out very early in the conversation that the peer workers in the safe space can't diagnose David, that that's not their job, but they can talk with him and through conversation perhaps shift how he's thinking and change his mind about this situation, and maybe shift his thinking about feeling like ending his life is the only way that he can respond to the torment of the chip that's been placed in his television. It was commented that David needs to feel like peer workers are on his level, and that the priority of the conversation wouldn't be to convince him that there is no chip in the television, but rather to focus on how David will be feeling when he's leaving the safe space. The conversation asked, is David willing to speak with the peer worker about why he feels that the only solution, the chip in the television, is to end his life? And to talk about when it was that the chip became a problem for him, and why it was that he made that decision, that the way to respond to the chip in the television was to end his life. And to ask David whether this has happened before and what's helped him in the past with coping with these sorts of experiences. It was really stressed that the ideas in the conversation don't want and need to not focus on fixing David's situation with the chip in the television, but rather talking about what's happening, providing the opportunity for him to calm down and to make a connection with an SPP worker, and to ask him what he wants from the SPP worker and how the SPP worker can help him or support him. He needs to be given reassurance, and the SPP workers need to make it clear that they're glad that David came here and that they can help keep him safe. Some people did raise the question of whether David has been taking his medication lately, and it was suggested that maybe it might be appropriate to ask him about whether he takes medication and whether that's something that he's been doing recently. In terms of the safe space, it was made really clear that David is not a risk to the safe space, but he may be a risk to himself. And so the big concern is what's going to happen when David leaves the safe space. It was asked whether at one point we would progress David through to the emergency department. So some people participating in the conversation did point out that if he said he wants to kill himself, and it's not possible to talk him out of that idea and out of that intention, that there's really no way to say that he won't, when he returns home, end his life. So there does need to be a point in the conversation where David is asked, do you feel like killing yourself? And have you thought about suicide, and have you made arrangements for how to do this? Another perspective was that maybe we could see, is David linked to a community mental health program? We do know that he's connected to a mental health service. Is he happy for information to be passed on to that service, and for that team to do some follow-up with him after he leaves the safe space? Because if that's available, he may not need to go to the emergency department right at this point in time. Some people in the conversation said we need to ask David whether he would like an appointment with someone to follow up the things that he's talked about, and to explore if this has been something that has caused him to feel this way. It was suggested that, ask generally into what's going on for David at this point in time. Has he eaten lately, for instance? And some people in the discussion did raise concern that if David is presented on a Friday or a Saturday and he can't be followed up the next day with the community mental health team, that's something the safe space needs to consider in terms of its response. So as you can see, again, just huge conversations around some really, really important issues with David's scenario. This is the last scenario that we looked at during that combined session, and got the input of health professionals and people with lived experiences to how the safe space could potentially respond to it. So it's about Amanda. Amanda is a 20-year-old woman with a history of past suicide attempts who comes into the safe space extremely distressed. She says that her life is not worth living, that she's tried everything to stop feel this way. She tells the SPP worker that she's been on dozens of medications, that she's tried therapy for childhood trauma, and that she's done everything that her psychologist told her, but nothing ever works, and she has run out of options. When the worker asks if she has plans to kill herself, she tells them that she has access to means for suicide and that she's just waiting for her mum and dad to leave her alone so she can end her life. Her history of previous suicide attempts is known to one of the safe space peer workers who has previously supported her in the emergency department. So again, we had some really important conversations around how the safe space in the Mid-North Coast district is going to respond to a situation like Amanda's. So in terms of the peer workers, a lot of people in the conversation pointed out that the safe space is the best space for somebody like Amanda to relate to someone. She wants someone who speaks the same language as her and who has been down this road before. So the importance of being able to speak to someone who has their own lived experience of suicide. It was also pointed out that a person who's at the point that Amanda is at, it's not going to be a quick fix. And the first thing that needs to happen is to reassure Amanda that this is not about putting her on another medication, because she's already raised the fact that medications haven't worked for her. And also that it's not about seeing another psychiatrist, because again, she said this is something that hasn't helped. They felt that conversation raised that very early on, it needs to be raised where she has access to means at home, and also whether she has had access to that means maybe tried to end her life already. There was some debate about who would be the best kind of peer worker for someone like Amanda, who's 20 years old. So some people felt that a younger peer worker would be a better match for her. Others felt that young people often prefer an older SP peer worker who seems motherly and nurturing. There were other views that age doesn't matter, that rather it's about connecting to someone through the language that is used when you talk about suicide and through having that common experience of having been through a suicidal crisis themselves, and that it's the person's story that matters. So it was pointed out that if the SP peer worker is unable to build rapport with Amanda, that they should ask permission to speak with another peer worker who does have more similar experiences, or ask her if she really does want to speak to someone that she's spoken to before and see if that's possible. The real focus of the conversation was the need for Amanda to feel listened to, and that the SP peer workers need to listen to her and see why suicide has come back into her life at this point in time, and to really see if this is an opportunity to de-escalate the crisis. So asking Amanda, what has brought this up again? And asking her about anything that has worked for her in the past, because she said a lot about what hasn't worked for her in the past. So maybe having that shift in focus to what has helped before. It was suggested that while the SP peer worker is finding out information about Amanda, about what her current stresses are, they might be able to reevaluate what the risk factors are for Amanda, and ask safety questions after rapport has been built with Amanda. So not sort of approaching these conversations by initially asking those risk-focused questions, but rather getting to know Amanda, building rapport with Amanda, having her feel comfortable, and then exploring issues around safety. Now, something that came out quite strongly in the conversation is that the fact that Amanda has approached the safe space at this point in time shows that Amanda is still holding on to that last bit of hope, and that she's gone to the safe space for help. Nothing else has worked, but she seems to be willing to give the safe space a chance. And so seeing this is a really important point in time for Amanda. She says she's tried everything before, and maybe hasn't tried working with an SP peer worker before, and having a conversation with an SP peer worker could be what works for her, and being open to that as a possibility and giving the chance for that to work. There was a lot of discussion about clinical involvement, when that should occur, if that should occur at all. It was fairly agreed on that there needs to be some kind of safety plan for Amanda before she leaves the safe space. So building connection and rapport. And if that doesn't happen, and they're unable, the SP peer workers are unable to build a trusting relationship with Amanda, or unable to develop a safety plan, that a clinician might need to be involved, and that she might need to go to hospital. Others viewed that Amanda has already expressed desire and intent to end her life, and that it's very clear just on the facts of the situation that she's not safe, and that a clinician might need to be involved right away. And there was never a real resolution of that in the conversation, but it's been really helpful to have both those perspectives brought out, to be able to report back to the LHD. It was suggested there could be a warm handover with Amanda's consent, and that a clinician could come to the safe space and explain the situation with Amanda present in a way that's really safe. It was pointed out that when a peer worker is doing a warm handover, clinicians could look up previous history of someone like Amanda to identify where the risk factors are. There was some debate about whether someone like Amanda would be willing to go to the emergency department. So some people felt that she wouldn't have gone to the safe space if she didn't want to be admitted to hospital, and she wouldn't have shared this information unless actually what she was seeking was for support to go to hospital. but others viewed that she might not want to go to hospital at all, and that is why she went to the safe space. And that if the suggestion was raised that she go to hospital, that Amanda might leave the safe space. And that if Amanda flees, that opportunity to help bring safety back into her life might be lost altogether. It was in fact commented that somebody with Amanda's history of things not working through the traditional system might see the safe space as a last resort, as the last potential place for help, and that if the suggestion was raised that she go to hospital, that she may never return to the safe space ever again. And so you can see there's a lot of divergence in the feelings that were raised by this scenario. So someone did question what happens if you ask her whether she would be willing to go to hospital and you don't get her permission around that, and what rights are being taken away at that point if that's an option that's taken, that she no longer has a choice over. As well as this real focus on the question as to what the role of the safe space should be, and what role the safe space should play in connecting people with clinicians and the emergency department, there was a really strong conversation around the needs of the peer workers in the safe space. So peer workers need, they also need the space to be safe for them to work in. They need referral, they need to debrief afterwards, after a situation like this one with Amanda. They need to be able to do that before they go home. So that means that supervision needs to be available, clinical support needs to be available, and there needs to be the option for them to have a check-in call when they get home. Also, it was said that there needs to be a really good plan for when guests leave, for a full debrief process to support the SP peer workers. And the comment was made that it'd be really good if SP peer workers were not working alone in the safe space. Just a few other comments. Oh, sorry about that. A few other comments on the connection between the safe space and the emergency department. That point that I raised earlier, that if the safe space links guests to the emergency department against their will, it is likely the guests won't return to the safe space in the future. And that means that it can't be a genuine alternative to the emergency department for people. It was also felt that any connection to the emergency department needs to be done in collaboration with the guest. So as much as possible with the support of the guest and not against the will of the guest. So this is just a direct quote from those conversations from one of the participants in that co-designed session. This is a participant who has lived experience and felt she understood Amanda's situation and said, "This is my last hurrah going to the safe space. You're still holding hope that the last bit of hope, that it is the last bit of, and that's why I'd go there, to hold that hope. I'd give it a go because nothing else has worked, and I'd give them, being the safe space, I'd give them a chance. I'd be saying to them, please don't put me in hospital." So just somebody who felt that they could really provide, I guess, a little bit of context of what it would be like to be someone in Amanda's situation. So we can provide some really useful information for the LHD now about what people in Mid-North Coast, both health professionals and people with lived experience, feel about the way that safe spaces should respond to some of these really quite complex situations. So we finished the session by asking the lived experience and health professional participants to name what was for them the non-negotiables in the setting up of a safe space in the Mid-North Coast area. Those non-negotiables were safety, safety and support for peer workers, including a system in place to support peer workers to debrief after their shift. And lots of people agreed with that as being a non-negotiable. Education and training for peer workers, that the safe space be out of the hospital and off hospital grounds, that the safe space focuses on positives, not the negatives, that it be a non-clinical space, So it can have a clinical manager, but they need to have a recovery model attitude, and they will need to work with the team to make the place wonderful. It needs to be a safe place for everyone, for people working there and people accessing the space as a guest. There need to be supports and connections from the safe space, both from and to the community. There needs to be no time limit for guests. So obviously that's something that people would like the safe space to work towards. 2 workers working at all times, and follow-up care for people who access the space for assistance. So I'm going to pass back on to Carrie now, who will let you know where this whole co-design process is going from here. Carrie, you're on mute.
Thank you. So thanks, Tina. I hope everyone can see just like the enormous contribution, the depth of insight, and that people are bringing, both professionals and people with lived experience, to this process, particularly in that combined session. It's just wonderful, all of the information that was gathered there. So the next step is the online survey, which is available after this webinar. There's a link below. That's also a link that will be on the landing page of the Roses website for this LHD. Closes on the 15th of December. As I said, super important to spread the word locally, particularly if you feel that there are those missing voices. Get them into the conversation. Still time to feed that information back to the LHD. So the feedback from the webinar as well as the survey will be gathered over the coming week and collated with all previously captured co-design outputs. Then Beacon Strategies, who's working with Roses in the Ocean, will develop a service model report that will be given to over to the LHD. A parallel processes will be the finalisation of the governance model, location, and staff recruitment. So that's been a parallel process going on throughout the session, the co-design process, and that will continue to be firmed up. And then Roses plays a guardianship role to support transfer of service model to actual service delivery. It also participates or facilitates the redesign workshop. So knowing that, speaking to the fact that genuine co-design is an iterative process, meaning that it continues for the life of the service. There'll be this redesign workshop in 3 to 6 months after opening. And really important is it doesn't bring just the original co-design participants, but hopefully it also includes guests, so you can really hear their experts by experience, not just their lived experience, but their lived experience of actually being a guest of the service. So I hope people can continue to get involved, to say this isn't the end of the process. While this has been a very important part of it, it's, there's lots of opportunities to continue to be involved in it. Just if there's, I'm not sure if there are any burning questions now. I know that we've taken up a lot of time, but we really wanted to provide a thorough overview of what's coming out, particularly just really honouring the fact that people in this local region have really made enormous contributions with their time, their energy, their commitment to seeing service improvement in the region. And if there's not, I guess we really want to wrap up by saying thank you very much to everyone that participated directly or indirectly through this process, and thank you to people that are going to continue to do that. A particular thank you to Nicholas and Sage from the LHD for all of their hard work behind the scenes to support this process, to make it meaningful for people in the local region. And we just want to say a very special thank you in this co-design process to the Leos. It's an enormous community asset when you have people that have already come together doing that grassroots community advocacy work. It serves communities so well when co-design processes come to your region. We see that, and we can't speak highly enough of the passion and energy and time that they've committed to that process. So thank you, and thanks to everyone. Really encourage you again to complete the survey. Tina, is there anything you'd like to say?
Sorry, I've got a tickle.
Okay.
Just thank you to everyone. Just really to repeat Carrie's words. People have, shared perspectives, even knowing that others may not share that perspective. And that's not just between health professionals and lived experience representatives. It's within those groups as well. And, it takes guts to do that. And it's just been so important in terms of us capturing ideas in this co-design process. So thank you.